Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Carolina Weather Group. This is the Wednesday, January 30th, 2019 edition of our little weather get-together. It's hard to believe that we've already went through the whole month of January. So tonight we're going to be kind of recapping the year of 2018 for both North and South Carolina. We have with us tonight Corey Davis. He works for the North Carolina climatology office for the state of North Carolina, and also panelist Melissa Griffin. She's going to be joining us to talk about the climatology in South Carolina for the year 2018. We know it was a very active year with floods and storms and hurricanes and even a few snow events. So we're going to be covering all of that tonight, and we'd love for you to participate along with us. We are streaming on Facebook Live, Periscope, and our YouTube page. So if you want to submit any questions, maybe you have questions for our guest tonight talking about a certain event, or if you want to bring and tell us what you experienced for the year of 2018 where you live at, we'd love for you to do that. All you got to do is drop those comments in the Facebook Live or the Periscope stream, or you can comment on the YouTube page, and we'll be able to monitor those throughout the night and make sure that we mention them as it sees fit. So if you are listening on the podcast version, we'll let Corey and Melissa give out some information towards the end of the show. That way, if you have any questions for them, you can tweet them or send them a message on the website or something like that, and that way they can answer your questions. So looking forward to tonight's show. We are first going to toss it to James Brierton, who's going to give us the latest updates in the weather world. James, over to you.
Thank you very much, Scotty. We'll start by taking things back to last Friday. Between this show and last show, we've been chronicling each and every Wednesday night here on the Carolina Weather Group the status of the government shutdown, and we've received at least one question online of, why are you guys talking about politics? And we're really not interested in talking politics, but we are interested in how this affects the weather community. So during that 3 to 4 week shutdown there, you'll recall that the National Weather Service and its employees were working throughout the country without pay. That has now been resolved, because you'll recall that last Friday we got the news that the government would be reopening after both sides, the Democrats and the Republicans, came to a spending bill that will buy us at least 3 weeks of spending for the government. So we're beginning to hear from those in the weather community, including this guy, Derek, who is a meteorologist, that his first paycheck has shown up. He tweeted this out here, saying that his first paycheck since the middle of December deposited 6 weeks of stress lifted off of his shoulders. So we're happy to hear that our friends at the National Weather Service across the Carolinas and around the country now have that behind them. We'll wait to see what happens on February 15th when this round of funding runs out. But for now, we're back to operational status quo at the National Weather Service. A question for Scotty or the rest of our panel. When we all came back on Monday, the first business day since the government formally reopened, did you guys spot any pieces of technology, any services that were back up and running that maybe you had missed since 2018?
To me, no. Most of my stuff is not actual NOAA links. Kind of comes through third-party stuff, like weather models and stuff like that. So for me, it wasn't a big deal. There were a few websites that I click on. There were certain links. I can't remember exactly what they were. Once in a while, I'd come to a link and it'd be like, okay, this is shut down. You can't access it. So I was like, okay, guess I won't be doing that this time. For the most part, it seems like majority of the stuff actually stayed up this time versus the past, where I know Moss data went down, a couple other things went down.
We use here on our weather show the EDD that National Weather Service puts out, the experimental data display. And at one point that went down for what I presume to be government shutdown reasons. And we'll be using that later on in tonight's broadcast when we're talking about the wicked cold that is moving across the country. We'll be showing you some maps from that. And that's just a tease ahead to coming up at the start of our 9 o'clock hour. We'll be talking about this cold snap. At least 8 people so far, unfortunately, nationwide, we're learning, have died because of these frigid cold temperatures that are well below freezing in a lot of parts of the country, Scotty.
Yeah, and James, you were asking, I guess the biggest thing that I was able to notice is a little bit more communication in our NWS chat. I know that things were kind of limited throughout the past couple of weeks with our folks in Greenville, South Carolina, wherever your local weather office is. So that was nice to have them back into a more full capacity. But Melissa, I'm sure you and Corey used a lot more information from NOAA that you're probably relieved to finally get access to the data that you need.
Yeah, it was a huge relief to get access back to information from the National Centers for Environmental Information, which is actually housed up in Asheville, North Carolina. It's the archive for all of the data that's collected by the National Weather Service primary stations and also the cooperative station network. So being able to get back to that climate data, and some of the other products that they do. I mean, they put out a state of the climate report every month to let us know what the statewide temperatures, the statewide precipitations were, the records. They do a lot of verification on this data, and we hadn't been able to access it. So I will tell you, it was a slow going once the servers finally came back up, just because everybody was trying to get all the data that they'd been missing for the last few weeks.
Yeah, I would say they couldn't have picked a much worse time to shut down the government, coming right at the start of a new calendar year, because of course that's when we do want to look at all that past weather data and climate information that the National Weather Service offices provide. At our office, we're also working on doing some evaluation of existing NOAA products like the Evaporative Demand Drought Index. So those are offline for a little while, but fortunately it looks like things are back up and running, and we'll hope for another good resolution before February 15th.
Hey, James, I thought of another thing about the government shutdown. We actually heard from one of our shows that we had scheduled in January. We actually heard from Ben Minot. He was with the USGS talking about how sorry he was he missed our show. So we were able to reschedule him, and we're going to be able to reschedule our Hurricane Center guests as well. So that was also a good thing. We were able to reestablish our contact with some of the shows that we had to cancel, unfortunately, due to the shutdown.
That is certainly good news. We look forward to bringing you those shows in future weeks.
Definitely so. I was playing catch up with my mute button there. So I guess let's get into tonight's show. We're kind of recapping the 2018 season for North and South Carolina. A lot of things took place in the area. We've seen a couple of tropical systems move through, a few winter weather events. Obviously, we've talked about how wet it was area-wide for North and South Carolina. So who better to bring in than Corey and Melissa, who's going to kind of recap what took place in the Carolinas over the past year. But before we do that, a lot of you folks who may not be fully invested in the weather community, maybe you just like to follow the weather, they may want to know, what exactly do you guys do? What is a climatologist? What is your day job? What information do you provide to meteorologists and state officials and stuff like that to help them out?
Well, I'm at the State Climate Offices of North Carolina, and we are a public service center for the state of North Carolina. So basically that means just what it says. We're serving the public. We're serving pretty much anyone across the state that can be affected by weather or climate. Historically, we've worked with a lot of different sectors across the state, from agriculture to transportation to forestry. A lot of my work has been especially with forestry and ag, as well as water resources, because they're affected by things like wildfires and drought. So again, trying to find the sensitivities that they have to weather and climate and be able to get them the information and the data that can help them address those needs. So that's one part of the job I have, and sort of one of the hats I wear. The other one is just following what's going on with weather and climate across the state. I write a lot of the posts for the climate blog that the North Carolina Climate Office puts out. We usually put out at least one post a month with a monthly climate summary. But like Scotty just said, we had some busy months last year with lots of big events. So we'll usually put out a recap post about those events right after they happen.
And in South Carolina, I do very similar work to what Corey does. I mean, our goal is to serve the citizens of South Carolina and provide them with weather and climate information for what they need. And that could be anyone from someone picking up the phone and asking me for temperature information for the year their granddaughter was born because they're making a blanket based on the colors of the high temperatures, which is a request that I've gotten recently, to actually doing detailed analysis on extreme precipitation, which is something our offices will taking a look at, especially after the floods that we've had in 2015, 16, 17, and 18, and looking at those extreme amounts of precipitation and looking at the return frequencies, the probability of exceedance. So I mean, we can run the gambit on what we do in our office, and that is but the main goal is to provide those services to the people that we serve.
Shay, I thought you I think your question was next.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll get off track there. Okay. So I wanted to ask you what you think about data and technology in today's world and how it's helping you come up with the numbers that you need to come up. I mean, you have statistics. I mean, tell us a little bit about some of the details that you come up with and how our data and technology is helping with that.
Sure. So I started working as an undergraduate student at the State Climate Office back in 2018. So I've been there going on 11 years now. And I'll say just in that time period, the growth of these big data sets has been amazing. You know, our bread and butter historically has always been looking at just the point observations. So what a weather observer or what a weather station was reporting. Now we're seeing a lot of these gridded data sets come online. In some cases, they're based off model forecast or model analysis. In some cases, these are future climate projections looking out more than a century down the line. But this is helping, for one, to fill in a lot of the gaps where we don't have observers and weather stations. But also it's giving us a more high resolution look at what's going on and what may happen in the future. So again, I think that's something that's changed just in the last 10 years or so. And I think that's probably the direction that we're going to keep going in terms of collecting weather and climate data, is just more of these big data sets. And we do have the capability to handle that now. You know, 10 years ago when I started there, I don't know if our servers could have handled a lot of those big data sets, but we've come a long way in that respect as well. So it's not trivial, but it's a lot easier now to be able to manipulate those and ultimately to get those into a form that is more easily consumed by users, by the public, by a specific sector.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of data points at the surface too. I mean, you also have to take in mind what points of data are relevant to what you're doing, right? Are they good? Are they quality? Do you find yourself having to QC a lot of this out of your reports and really kind of pick and choose? You know, how does USGS factor into that with the Weather Service data and ASOS stations? You name it. There's a whole array of systems out there in Mesonettes. So talk a little bit about like how you disseminate what you see versus what is actually like what will come out in a report.
Sure. So I can talk about what our office has done with our network. We operate 42 weather stations. It's our Econet in North Carolina, and then there's one in South Carolina on Sassafras Mountain right across the border. But again, when I started there, we had a lot of these stations already, but we weren't really doing anything to verify the accuracy of the data. That became one of our big internal projects because we wanted to make sure the information that we were spreading to folks was as accurate as it could be. And if we felt that there were any doubts about that data, that we were pretty clear about what those were. So we undertook a big project to increase the amount of quality control we're doing. In some cases, that's looking at the range of values. For instance, in January, you might expect high temperatures to be anywhere from, say, the 20s up to the 70s. In the summer, obviously, that range would be different. We're also doing what we call a buddy check, so checking values that nearby stations are reporting. And then for some of our sensors that have been out in the field for years, we know that they can tend to drift a little over time. In fact, that's one of the first big things we noticed was our solar radiation sensors tended to have that drift to them. So it might not be something that was easy to notice if you just requested data from our office and looked at it. But when you looked at 3, 4, 5 years of data, it was pretty obvious that something was going on. So again, just by implementing a lot of these checks, we have been able to catch a lot of those bad values. Another thing is because we're doing those checks in real time, we're able to catch issues sooner. We've got a couple of really fine technicians at our office that are able to get out in the field and fix those issues faster now. So for instance, if we think there might be a temperature sensor that's failing or a rain gauge that's clogged, we can know about that a lot sooner and get that figured out. So again, we'll have a longer period of time with good quality data.
Right. And going forward, I mean, you just mentioned earlier the past 10 years, and a lot of weather sort of climate reports, things that come out long term are done in decadal time periods, right? So we're looking at, from here going forward, things are just going to get better and better. You're going to get more and more exact over time versus what 1950 would have showed versus, 1950 to 60 versus 2010 to 2020. You'll see a huge upswing in that. So looking forward to continuing to watch your reports.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like you say, it's a big investment to try to make sure you're putting stations in that are reporting quality data and will be there for a long time. And I'm sure Melissa can talk more about this as well. But, we are invested in that, again, as a public service center. So we're in for the long haul.
And you know, along with the technology and the ability to collect all these values, whether they're at the surface or, you know, above the surface, and this has been a change that I've noticed in the technology. When I started my career, I'm not even going to tell you how many years ago, computer programming was still just Fortran. And since then, there has been an increase in the number of programming languages that are now being used in order to do the analysis on this data. And so we've got programs like R, which is a statistical package, which is really helpful. We had, you know, IDL, which was one of the first, you know, languages I learned after Fortran, and then MATLAB, and now Python, and you've got SQL, and all these different languages that are really helping it, you know, to be able to take these large data sets and pare them down to, you know, yearly and even like seasonally, seasonal data that we can then use to help talk about what we're seeing, what have been, you know, these events that have happened in the last 10 years, or, you know, what have we seen these changes in these events in the last 10 years. So it's been a really kind of neat, you know, time to kind of really grow in your career, just because of so many of the changes that we've seen since, you know, the 1990s. So.
And so I was able to look at some of your slides that we're getting ready to show, talking about, you know, what's happened in the Carolinas over the past year. But before we do that, something that I want to ask you guys, just for the audience who may not recognize this, we see seasons different here in the weather community, the climate community. Our summer is a little bit different than what the astronomical summer would be. And it varies by a couple of weeks. So could Melissa maybe explain why our summer may not be starting on June 21st, where our summer actually starts June 1st? Kind of talk about why we categorize our seasons a little bit different than the astronomical calendar would say.
So yeah, there are two different distinct seasons. So Scotty has mentioned astronomical and meteorological. So the astronomical seasons really refer to kind of the position of the Earth's orbit around the sun. And so you'll see, you know, our equinoxes, which are typically around the middle of, we've got one coming up in the middle of March, which is the vernal equinox, which is usually a transition to spring. And then we have the summer one that's in the middle of June. You know, our fall equinox is in the middle of September, and then our winter solstice or winter, you know, is in the middle of December. But to make it easier for meteorologists, we've kind of backdate that. So our four seasons, winter, spring, summer, and fall, are actually based on the calendar. And there are a couple of reasons why it's easy to equally split the seasons among these 3 months on this calendar, because it makes it easier for our observations. It makes it a little bit easier for forecasts, and it makes it easy to do these statistical analysis that I was talking to you about on a seasonal scale, because the equinox can change its date. So for example, you know, it could be March 20th or March 21st or March 22nd. We just stick with the standard calendar, and that way we're able to compute these a little bit easier.
Sounds good. So next time, maybe if you hear your TV meteorologist, or you hear us refer to summer starting June 1st instead of June 21st, you'll kind of have a better idea. So with that, let's go ahead and look at some of the data. Do you guys want to flip a coin? Who do we want to go, North or South Carolina first? Anybody have a preference? All right, let's shoot. Let's go South Carolina first. We'll do ladies first. So let's pop up some of the data for South Carolina, and Melissa, I'll let you go through some of it.
Okay, so you know, talking about these seasonal statistics, I think that's going to be the great place to start. So when we're talking about winter, this is actually looking at December of 2007 through January and February of this past year, and our average temperature across that time period was about 48.6 degrees, and that was actually a departure of 2.8 degrees higher than what we typically see. But our precipitation was lower. We were almost a little over 2.5 inches lower in our precipitation. And as we transitioned into our spring, we actually saw an increase in our precipitation, but it was only 1 month that drove that increase. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, about when I get into the months that are driving these seasons. And we pretty much had a spring that was right on what we would expect for this, you know, for normal, which we were right at about 61.9 degrees, which was just a little bit off, a little bit below what our normal was. But our annual but our average precipitation for spring was, these are statewide averages, was 13.78. So we were almost 2 3/4 inches above what we normally see during the springtime. Our summer was right at 80 degrees. And so when I'm talking about these average temperatures, this is highs, lows put together to come up with this average temperature value that you're seeing. And that was a deviation of 1.3 degrees above normal, what we see. And even, at an average precipitation value of about 14 inches, we were still actually a little bit low on the side, on the side of our precipitation during the summer. Our fall was the sixth wettest fall on record, and that's looking back at data that goes back to 1895. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to guess that maybe Florence had something to do with that. But also, we had a pretty wet November. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. 16.46, almost 16.5 inches statewide, if you think about it, in rainfall. But to go along with that, it was also a really warm fall, too. We were 66.1, which is a little more than 2.5 degrees above what we normally would see in our fall. Now, our annual, I put stars next to the annual numbers here because they're still going through the preliminary analysis, especially since the National Center for Environmental Information is just reopened. They're still doing a lot of these calculations and pulling in data, but we could actually be looking at the 10th warmest year on record and also the 10th wettest year on record when you just take a look seasonally across the state of South Carolina. So, there are a lot of numbers thrown at you, but, if we get into the nitty gritty of each month, then I can actually have a chance to talk about what's going on, what was driving each one of these individual factors. We'll start with talking about January. January was, it started off kind of interesting because I know a lot of people were really interested in the fact that we got snow. And we got snow in a really weird place, too. As I'm sure Shay and Jared can attest, I believe if you guys jump in here, I think we had almost 8 inches of snow in some locations, didn't we? So, down in the Charleston area. So did you have a question, Scotty?
I was going to say, as you were talking about the temperatures right quick, maybe something that a lot of our followers, again, in the weather community, we kind of know this, but the high temperatures, like the 80-degree average for summer, we know in the daytime it's really hot, but we're starting to notice that nighttime temperatures are not cooling down as much as what they should be.
And that's actually, if you look back on the graph, we can jump ahead to February. February was the warmest February on record. And the reason, and when we look back at the data that actually is included in that, just to give you an idea, the temperature, the average statewide temperature for February was 57.4 degrees. That's 10.5 degrees above what we normally would see. And it did have to do with some of the high temperatures. For statewide, there were over 103 record maximum temperatures that were broken in February. And that was between towards the end, in the middle of February to the end of February. The highest temperature that was recorded in February was 87 degrees down, towards the Marine Corps Station in Beaufort County on the 25th of February. But startling enough, it was the minimum temperatures. The minimum temperatures, almost 200 high minimum temperatures were broken in the month of February in South Carolina. And having those values so high was what was driving to this increase in temperature that we actually saw for the month. And, just to give you an idea, one of the records that I saw, 67 degrees as a minimum temperature in Clarks Hill on the 22nd of February. And that broke the previous record of 55 degrees. So you're looking at a 12-degree difference. And that record had been standing since 1971. So, to kind of, mention what Scotty was talking about, seeing these changes in minimum temperatures really can drive what we see the outcome in these average temperatures from a standpoint are. kind of follow along just a little bit, we'll go through the rest of our spring. I'll kind of do a quick overview of spring. So for spring, March was kind of dry for the state. We had below normal rainfall. Many of the stations were also reporting drier conditions. We were still in a drought at that point here in South Carolina. We were still dealing with dry conditions throughout the state. And April was kind of an interesting month. We did have some low temperatures, and it was, it was one of those where it was like not necessarily super cool, but it was definitely colder than what we would typically see in April. But that really kind of led to a severe weather event that we had at the middle of the month. So we saw 5 tornadoes that were reported in the Midlands on the 15th of April, one of those being an EF2 that went through the Lexington area. Shay, did you have a question?
I did, actually. You brought up the word drought. And so we look at the drought monitor and we see what they're putting up. And I'm imagining that all this data is coming from the individual states feeding into this giant product that they put out. We know when it's dry here. We know when it doesn't rain for a long period of time. The coastal environment's a little bit different with the sea breezing effect and everything. But my question is how is the drought monitor brought up? Like, is it measured in soil content moisture, or is it lack of rain in certain areas? Is it tied into the CocoRa's network? I mean, how do they kind of make this an artistic product?
Well, the drought monitor is just one of the products that we use here in South Carolina. We actually have a statewide drought committee that meets from the different drought area, different designated drought areas. And so we have people from forestry, agriculture, water resources that are also contributing information and data that we then can use to determine whether or not there are dry conditions that are going on. But things that we do look at, we look at river levels, we look at stream flows, we look at soil conditions, soil moisture, soil temperature. We look at the temperature because that's going to help, with evaporation processes. We look at whether or not we've gotten rain, where have we gotten rain, where haven't we gotten the rain. So there's a lot of these different things that go into this. And the CocoRa's program does help fill in those gaps where we do have, where we are missing some rainfall measurements. We may not have a National Weather Service station. So having a volunteer provide that information is also very helpful. And their comments that they also include in their reports, it can have a wealth of information. Something as simple as I have had to water my garden the last 3 days because, my plants are starting to wilt, or my grass is completely brown because we haven't had a single drop in rain in weeks. Those comments can be extremely helpful when we're trying to determine where droughts are. So each state has a bunch of, it kind of varies state to state, but I have seen some states where you have a committee that comes together, they bring in all these information from all these different sectors, and then that information actually goes to the National Drought Monitor and the author for the product for that week. And then they will make suggested changes based on the information that they've received. And they'll either increase or decrease the amount, the area and the category of drought based on that particular information.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. So we were dealing with drought. We had tornadoes in April, and then we ended up with rain in May. It was subtropical storm Alberto, which I know Scotty has talked about quite a few times, and the Carolina Weather Group and the impacts of that particular storm had in the upstate. But the rainfall from that storm, along with some other storms that we had that moved across the state, helped bring South Carolina basically out of drought. And it was the 8th wettest May on record for the state. And so that's pretty good to come out of that drought. And it was really nice because I know that we were, that lingering drought was really starting to cause an issue. So we were able to, drop the drought declarations and move forward. But interesting enough, even with all that rain and cloud cover, the state was still above normal. It was 3.4 degrees above normal statewide. It was the 6th warmest May on record. And June was crazy too. It was the 8th warmest June on record for the state of South Carolina. Between June 19th and 24th, we had many stations in the state that had reported multiple days over 100 degrees for their maximum temperature. We had heat index values in some areas that were over 115 degrees. And the clash between that really warm weather and a late season, pretty strong cold front actually produced a severe weather event for the state towards the end of June. We actually had some damaging wind and hail. July was maybe the only month where the temperature was near normal and the precipitation was near normal. But we did have an event, again, down along the coast in the Charleston area, where we had 2 CoCoRaHS observers in the downtown Charleston, Daniel Island area in one morning reported 8 inches of rain. And at the airport station, the Charleston airport station, they only had 1.28 inches of rain. It caused a lot of flooding in that area. And I know that you guys were impacted by that too, weren't you?
Yeah, that's that urban heat island effect we know is slowly developing as commercial development grows in the city, and you see these thunderstorms. It takes the right kind of upper winds, usually like a west-southwest wind, just blowing those thunderstorms being the sea breeze front, and it just prolongs. You get that superheating over the city that just prolongs those thunderstorms downwind. So yeah, we see that quite a bit here. It seems to be more and more. I'm not sure if the Weather Service is thinking about factoring that into their forecast coming down the road, but not yet.
Yeah, and we started to actually dry out again in the summer in August. At one point, we were actually sitting in the Climate Center office and talking about whether or not we were going to have to call a drought committee meeting. And we had scheduled one to talk about the potential of having to add drought back in to south portions of South Carolina, especially the PD. We had record low flows in August in the PD region. And honestly, I think that was one of the reasons why the potential or the flooding from Hurricane Florence may have not been as bad as it could have been, because some of those rivers that were in the PD were at their record low flows for the summer. So September was dominated by tropical storm Florence as it came across South Carolina. And record heat. We were warm again in the month of South Carolina, even with all that rainfall.
I lay down
just to kind of give you an idea.
The wind just
it
howled.
was our third
wind
howled
and howled some more.
Again, that's looking back statewide.
And it was so deafening loud. I mean, at one point, the
average temperature
I was laying down. It wasn't real bad. Maybe until about noon.
79.4, which was
once the eye,
the
center.
And then October was the same. We were hot.
Started across the South Carolina. We got within
October on record. We had Hurricane Michael come through. So just kind of leading into the our fall, we already had 2 months of record warmth. And we'd had 2, tropical systems that had affected our state. We get into November and it just started raining, and it just almost seemed like it was raining every, 3 to 5 days. We were picking up another storm. And November's actually came in as the 7th wettest November on record. And we had some king tide issues towards the end of the month, where I believe Charleston Harbor recorded its 5th highest tide. I think the record goes back to 1901. It even beat out the tide that was seen in the 2015 event. And then, of course, December, we are again looking at December, I believe. Once the preliminary numbers are in and done, December could be the 2nd wettest December on record. So we kind of finished we just kind of really finished the year extremely hot to begin with, and then extremely wet. We also had that snow event in the upstate the beginning of December. So it's just kind of an overview real quick of the seasons and just kind of month to month what happened. But with that, I think I should kick it up to my colleague, Corey, to kind of talk about some of the impacts that they've had, both seasonally and, some of the more important and significant impacts they had in 2018.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa, for the lead-in. So for the most part, North Carolina's weather looked pretty similar to South Carolina's, but there were a few differences. So I laid out my table a little bit different than Melissa's. Instead of looking at departures from normal, I looked at rankings. Like she said, this is compared to conditions going back to 1895, so out of the past 124 years. So we'll just sort of go in order, and I'll try to talk month by month through this as well. You can see first off that it was a little bit warmer and a little bit drier for last winter. I can pretty much guarantee no one in North Carolina will tell you it was warm and dry last winter, because they're going to remember two things. They're going to remember how snowy it was in January and March, and they're going to remember the really cold stretch of almost 2 weeks that we had to start off the year. So again, this is what happens when you look at 3-month aggregates, is you tend to get sort of those really snowy periods and really cold periods that sort of average out with what in our case ended up being a fairly warm and fairly dry February. So again, I think the month of January last year was probably the most impactful. Like I said, we started with that really cold stretch that began on Christmas Eve in 2017 and lasted through the end of the first week of January. During that stretch, we did have one wintry event that we'll talk about, I'm sure, in just a minute here. And then after that, conditions did start to warm up a little bit. And again, that lasted through the month of February. In fact, it was our second warmest February on record in North Carolina. And it was just slightly drier than normal in the month of February as well. Also, last February, in the middle of the month, we had high temperatures that warmed up into the 80s. So pretty much a false spring, which we have seen some in recent years. But as often happens when we see that late winter warm up, temperatures eventually crash back down. And that's what happened in March. We started the spring with our 13th coolest March on record. And again, we had 2 snow events across the northern Piedmont, one as late as March 25th, which is unusually late to see accumulating snow here in the Piedmont of North Carolina. And then, as you can see for the spring, it did finish a little bit cooler than normal overall. April was also a little bit cooler than normal. It was our 11th coolest April on record. But April also sort of kickstarted our wet pattern that, as you can see, pretty much lasted the rest of the year. It was our 10th wettest April on record. As part of all the rain and storms that we were getting, we did see a couple of tornadoes. There was one EF2 tornado that hit Guilford County, including Greensboro and Rockingham County, and then an EF1 tornado just to the east of me here in Wendell. The Greensboro tornado was notable because it destroyed an elementary school there. It was also credited for 10 injuries in Greensboro as well. But other than that, it wasn't a very active severe weather spring for North Carolina, even though we got so much rain. Those were really the only 2 major severe events that we saw for the first half of the year. The month of May was, again, just notable for how wet it was. It was our wettest May on record in North Carolina, as well as our 3rd warmest May. So again, Melissa mentioned Subtropical Storm Alberto. That storm alone brought almost 21 inches of rain atop Mount Mitchell. So a very sizable rain event. There were also some landslides during that storm. So again, for a fairly early season, as far as tropical season goes, fairly early season storm to see such impacts from. Another thing that was sort of notable about May is that it sort of started that really humid summer that we had. The summer overall wasn't particularly hot. You can see it was a little bit warmer than normal, but man, was it humid. And we didn't see any real prolonged heat waves or stretches of 90 or 100 degree weather. But especially because of those overnight lows being a little bit above normal, it seemed like we just couldn't escape that heat and humidity all summer. And again, you can see here, it was a little bit warmer than normal. It was actually our second driest season of the year, but again, it was still on the wet side. And another thing that was sort of notable from the summer was how wet it was right along the immediate coast, especially at the Outer Banks. In the month of July, Cape Hatteras had more than 20 inches of rain. That wasn't just their wettest July on record. It was their wettest month, period, on record. So again, for none of that rain to come from tropical storms, that's pretty impressive. And I think that's one of the sort of memorable things about 2018 is even though we did see a couple tropical events in the fall, how earlier in the summer, it just stayed wet without seeing these storms come through. There was just so much moisture coming off the Atlantic, coming off the Gulf Stream, especially right along the coast there. And then again, as we headed toward the end of the summer, we also started getting into a little bit of a dry stretch, mainly across the southern Piedmont and the southern coastal plain. I think Melissa in South Carolina tried to send some of their drought up our way. In fact, we did have one county, Union County, just east of Charlotte, that did get in moderate drought conditions on the U.S. Drought Monitor by late August. But of course, we know what happened a couple weeks after that. We got to mid-September, and Hurricane Florence came in and just dropped absolutely torrential rainfall across most of the state. It's no surprise then that September ended up being very wet overall. It was also pretty warm because we kept that summer pattern going where we really didn't get a whole lot of breaks from the heat and the humidity. And then it's sort of that double whammy. Less than a month later, Tropical Storm Michael came through. Michael was notable not so much for the rain, and it did bring pretty reasonable rain amounts, especially in the western half of the state, but mainly just for the wind that it kept this far north. For places like the Piedmont Triad, this is the worst wind event that they've seen from a storm since Hurricane Hugo in 1989. So again, pretty substantial damage, and it sort of makes sense with such wet ground after such wet weather they'd had over the past month. It doesn't take much to knock a lot of trees down, and that's what they did see, especially across the western and northwestern Piedmont. And Michael was sort of also the harbinger of change for our weather going into the second part of the fall, where we had been locked in more of this upper level ridging pattern. Instead, Michael sort of shifted that ridge offshore and instead brought in more of the sort of troughing conditions in the jet stream that has led us to see these multiple rain events generally every week or every few days. And again, as you can see here, it was the wettest fall on record in North Carolina. That 16th warmest can be a little misleading because actually the month of November was a little bit cooler than normal. It was our 27th coolest November on record. And along with those rain showers and storms we saw in November, we did have 3 more tornadoes along the coast in Carteret County on November the 13th and November the 24th. And then finally, as we get into December, of course, early in the month, we switched into a pretty cool pattern in that snow event that we had about a week into the month. The rest of December was pretty mild overall, and it ended up finishing as our 41st warmest December on record, so a little bit warmer than normal, but it was our wettest December on record. And you can see for the annual totals there as well, it was not so much memorable for how warm it was, but definitely for how wet it was. The statewide average annual precipitation in North Carolina is about 49 inches, and we were at 72.5 inches last year. So again, just goes to show how far above normal we were. And like I say, it would be easy to blame Florence or Michael, a single event or 1 or 2 events for putting us, over that threshold. But the fact is, we had been very wet before that. In fact, after Florence came through, Wilmington had already broken their previous annual rainfall records. So it was just sort of the icing on the cake as far as a wet year goes. But again, I think that the operative word for 2018 in North Carolina was definitely wet.
So quick question for you. So you're talking about the rainfall amounts coming from basically 3 different types of sources of moisture. Number 1, tropical. Number 2, Atlantic moisture. And then number 3, jet stream moisture. So we talk about transports, and we get a connection to the Gulf of Mexico, which connects to the Pacific, and so you get this moisture train. Talk a little bit about some of the differences there. I mean, we know what tropical systems can bring, but what's the difference between, say, west to east transported off the Atlantic versus west to east from the jet stream?
Sure. So a lot of that Gulf moisture that we have tapped into has been just in the past few months. And at least one cause of that is because of the El Nino pattern that we're in now. El Nino tends to strengthen the subtropical jet stream and that storm track that usually does tend to come through the Gulf of Mexico. So again, we've seen just storm after storm coming to our south and then up the coast. And that's just helped to bring in all that Gulf moisture. And you can see from the map here, this is departure from normal precipitation across the southeast last year. Pretty much everywhere except for just a few pockets of Georgia and then South Florida was wetter than normal for the year of 2018. And again, you can just sort of imagine that storm track coming through basically across the Florida panhandle and then up the coast. Of course, you can also see that signature of Florence, especially with some of those really heavy rainfall totals, 150 to 200% of normal precipitation last year in parts of the southern coastal plain. But again, like we also saw beginning with Michael, we did see more troughing in the jet stream. That's another thing that, for instance, can help bring upper level low pressure systems through. And that was actually one of the drivers behind some of the severe weather events that we had in the month of November. So again, it doesn't necessarily have to be moisture or storms that come off the Atlantic or through the Gulf. Those upper level systems can also be fairly impactful.
Wow, I think one other thing is, what were the rainfall totals for both North Carolina and South Carolina?
So for the annual total, again, the average was about 72.5 inches, but there were a number of stations that did break their previous records. So Wilmington's probably the most notable. They got 102.5 inches, so they broke the 100-inch mark for the first time. At Hatteras, they had 90 inches. At Greensboro and Raleigh, they were a little over 60 inches, and Greensboro did have its wettest year on record. And I really like this graph because it sort of shows how precipitation fell throughout the year. You can see really up until the midway point of the year, we were only on pace with our normal precipitation in Greensboro. And then it wasn't until we did start to get into August. You can see that big spike in September from Florence, and then again one in early October from Michael. Then after that, the slope of that line really picks up a lot. And again, that's just from those regular rainfall events. Also plotted on here is the previous record holder of 1877. And you can see that line sort of flattens out after you get past tropical season, late September, early October. They didn't have a very wet fall that year, but we certainly did this year. And then I think that the slide before this may be the same graph for Wilmington. And it's fairly similar in some ways, but you can see Wilmington didn't waste any time. They had a pretty wet spring, so by the time they were in May, June, they were already ahead of the previous record. And again, the spike that they saw from Florence is just unbelievable. More than 20 inches of rain from that single event. Of course, they didn't have as much from Michael there because that was mainly a western storm, but still you can see pretty steady increases throughout the months of October, November, December to finally get that 100-inch mark.
So 90 to 100 inches. Do you know what an average rainfall amount for the Amazon tropical rainforest would be?
I do not, but because you asked that, I suspect you have an answer for me.
I don't. I'm just asking if anybody knows, like to do a comparison. One of the wettest spots on the planet, and then North Carolina in 2018. It's kind of like you wonder, being in the subtropical climate, North Carolina being at the top tier of that. That's interesting. I think Evan had a question. Evan, I think you're on mute. Nope, I guess his microphone's not working.
Oh, there you go.
There you go.
Oh, there we go. That was weird. Okay. So regarding Mount Mitchell, I believe, I'm sure you haven't finished quality testing all the data yet, but Mount Mitchell saw somewhere in the neighborhood of 130 something inches. Will that be, if that passes all of the quality control tests and that stuff, will that be a new state record, or is that still too early to discuss?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's actually one thing that was slowed down or delayed a little bit by the government shutdown, because it'll typically be the local National Weather Service office for that location that sort of takes the lead on those investigations. For Mount Mitchell, that'll be the Greenville-Spartanburg office. A couple years ago, they led an investigation into a snow amount that could have been a new daily record snowfall total for Mitchell that ended up getting denied. But in this case, it seems like a very strong case that this was not only the wettest year on record for Mount Mitchell, but the wettest year for any station in North Carolina. So again, it looks like the final total from the National Weather Service Cooperative Observer Station there was 139.94 inches. The previous record was somewhere around 130 inches. So again, definitely a very wet year overall. Our office operates a mesonet station on Mount Mitchell. It also had north of 130 inches. So the investigation that I'm sure our office will be a part of will certainly look at all data sources available for that location. Just to sort of put into perspective how wet it was there, the average precipitation at Mount Mitchell is 74 inches. So they almost got twice that amount in 2018. And again, a lot of that came from just several big events. Alberta with more than 20 inches. During Florence, they had 14 inches, which was a single day record for that site. So even though it wasn't the snowiest year on Mitchell, it was definitely a pretty rainy one.
One more second. Did you say 14 inches in one day?
Yeah, so
Wow.
that was as Florence had moved in. It had sort of lost a lot of its punch, and as far as winds go. But yeah, just that upslope flow, going up more than a mile. Mount Mitchell is more than 6,600 feet above sea level, so it tends to see pretty amplified rainfall totals when you get that much moisture coming in and sort of upsloping that much.
And I did look at the numbers for the Amazon River Basin. Is usually right around 3,000 millimeters per year, maybe a little bit over that, which translates to about 118 inches per year. So North Carolina, not far off of that.
And Corey brought forward a really good point, not only and Evan asked a question about Mount Mitchell, but we're also looking at a potentially new record rainfall value for annual rainfall value for South Carolina. And it also happens to be in the same area with the National Weather Service up in Greer having to also take a lead on that one. And that was at the station that's located just north of Jocassee, South Carolina. And they recorded a annual total of 123.45 inches of rainfall. And yes, we're definitely looking at that because it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're trying to verify that the numbers do actually add up to that. But if you took a look, we've got a similar graphic to the one that Corey had for the Wilmington and Greensboro area. But you can look and just see that they actually started off wet and it was just the whole year was wet. They did not get much rain from Florence. I don't even believe they recorded any rain from Florence, and just a little bit of rain from Michael when it came through. It was just a really wet year. And so they beat out their previous record. But what they did also beat out was the potentially the record, once we verify it, of 119 inches that was recorded back at Hogback Mountain in 1979. That had been the state record. So potentially two records set for annual rainfall totals across the Carolinas in just this past year. So we have to go through the same process. We're working with the National Weather Service office, and of course, people up at the National Center for Environmental Information up in Asheville to do that verification process.
Corey, and Melissa, I know we're a little bit past 9 o'clock, so we don't want to keep you all night. I think we could ask you all these questions about where we live, but Corey, you provided a graphic talking about the severe weather in North Carolina, and looking at it now, it shows 33 confirmed tornadoes with approximately maybe 40 for the year. I would say most of those was probably from Florence. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. Yeah, of those 33 confirmed, 23 happened during Florence. So like I said earlier, it wasn't a very active severe weather year overall, but just with those tornadoes, Florence alone put it above that sort of 30-year average of about 25 or 26 tornadoes.
And the one that really stands out to me is the lack of hail reports or the lack of large hail. I guess quarter or larger is probably what we're basing this off of. But the average is around 218, 19 reports out of the year, and we only had 60. So, and come to think about it, I don't remember any big hail events happening here in Western North Carolina this year. So, I just found that fascinating as well, the lack of large hail reports. But as always, I'm assuming Florence probably had something to do with the high winds as well, with that larger than average number.
Yeah, and the other thing you'll notice with the high winds is that it wasn't just along the coast, but it was actually those blue dots were pretty well distributed all across the state. So again, we definitely saw a lot during Michael and some during Florence, but just overall, we had some pretty big winds, not necessarily severe in nature, but it could have just been a straight line events or, with the remnants of those storms as they move through.
Good information. Well, guys, I know we're a little past 9 o'clock. Any other questions before we wrap up with our main topic and get to a break? All right. I don't see any. So, Corey, we have Melissa on with us all the time. So our followers probably know how to get in touch with her, but we'll still let her plug how to do that. But first of all, if more folks are interested in about the 2018 climate review for North Carolina, is there a website, maybe a social media account that they can follow to get this information?
Sure. Yeah. So following us on Twitter, it's at NCSCO for North Carolina State Climate Office. That's the great way to stay updated with all the information we put out, including our blog posts. For instance, we'll have our January climate summary coming out next week, so you can stay tuned for that. And just in general, you can access our website at climate.ncsu.edu. On there, we have access to a lot of our data, a lot of our other resources. So we hope folks will take advantage of those. Again, we're a public service center. We're here to help you out if you're in the state of North Carolina. So we hope folks will take a look at those.
And it's a fantastic website. I use it a lot. So definitely go check out that website. And Melissa, for our followers in South Carolina, how can they learn more about the climate review for 2018 and just what you guys do in general?
We have the climate review available on the South Carolina State Climatology Office website. So if they actually go look at South Carolina DNR and follow the links for climate, they will come to our website, and we've got that particular report is on the front page along with overviews of Florence and 2015, the floods from 2015, from Matthew in 2016, the lunar eclipse report. So we've got a lot of really good reports on the front page. And then if anyone's interested in climate information, I'm usually putting it out on my Twitter, which is at MLGriffinWX1. You guys can follow me on Twitter. And normally I try and put out at least one climate fact for the state of South Carolina every day and try and follow up with the CoCross observations that we get from our observers.
All right, great information. So make sure you go utilize those websites. We're going to go to a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to be talking about the polar vortex and just how cold it is up to our north. Yeah, that cold air makes you, we want to make sure that you're prepared for that cold air. So that was a good graphic of what you should have in your vehicle if you're out traveling. And speaking of traveling, you may miss panelist Chris Jackson tonight. He is actually up in the Midwest following the record cold and the snow. And I think we got some video of that here in just a little bit. Before we talk about the Midwest, I want to talk about locally here in the Carolinas, what we're experiencing. So I want to bring in Ricky Matthews because, Ricky, you cover East Tennessee, but also the North Carolina mountains, and Evan as well. You can jump in here too. It's cold in the Carolinas, but really we're seeing the really cold air confined to the mountains.
Yeah, we have wind chill advisories in effect for a lot of our mountain counties tonight, as they'll likely drop below -15, perhaps up to -20 in spots. So that's the big story there. This overnight stretch of below zero temperatures in spots, especially in the highest mountain peaks. I think most of the cities probably won't drop below zero. They'll get in the single digits. Boone will get close, and then we'll see even single-digit temperatures in parts of the Tri-Cities area, East Tennessee, parts of Carter County, parts of Ashe County, Watauga. They'll likely drop down into the single digits. And, of course, those wind chill values will be cold tonight. But Evan and I kind of dug up some interesting info earlier, as my mouse dies, about how temperatures, are cold, but we've had some record cold before. He dug up some information for the Tri-Cities Airport, which is about 20 miles west of the state line there, North Carolina and Tennessee. We got down to -40 once for a wind chill. That was back in the 80s. So it could always be worse, guys. I guess that's what I'm trying to say there.
Yeah, I think Chicago, they're now calling it Shaberia or something like that. I've been seeing from reports. A friend of mine, Mike Fomel, he's a producer for the Weather Channel, and he's been sharing with me on social media. Just he's in Chicago right now, and just how cold it is there. At one time, his glasses had frost around it. So
Scotty, one of my friends who's a meteorologist up in Wisconsin was talking today about the cold, and people asked, what are some of the things that you notice with this cold? And this can be kind of gross, but he said the snot freezes. So if your nose starts running, your snot freezes. You walk out to your car and, the wind hits you, you have some teardrops that form in your eyes. Well, you get icicles on your eyelashes because of the cold. Of course, the car's not starting. That's a big thing. Some of the other things you may have seen, they were lighting railroad tracks on fire in Chicago today. I thought that was neat.
I saw that, yeah.
What else?
Oh, well, I know you're an aviation buff. I know there's been a lot of delays and cancellations at the airports up there just because it's so cold that you have to de-ice planes and stuff. So I know that's been a big story up there as well.
That is, but I saw an interesting story today. Minot, North Dakota, of course, is where they keep a lot of our B-52s. And there's an Air Force base there. And they were saying, hey, are the B-52s still flying? Because it's got a wind chill like -40 up there. When you think about it, temperature decreases with height, right? So these B-52s don't care what the temperature is. The airplanes don't care at all. The people flying them do, because they've got to go out the planes and pre-flight them and everything like that. But aircraft themselves, you know, are well equipped to fly in temperatures of -60, -70 up at altitude where a lot of these aircraft fly. So cold doesn't bother the planes. In fact, it's almost better for them because they fly more efficiently and the engines perform better. But the people on the ground loading your luggage and making sure all the planes are serviced, they don't like the cold for sure.
I don't know if I tweeted this out last night or this morning, but some of the Postal Service offices were canceling mail delivery today just because of the cold. So, you know, we've always heard that saying that the post office will deliver your mail in rain, hail, sleet, or snow, but I guess really cold Arctic temperatures, they don't do that. Evan, bring you in because you're based out of the mountains, but you're in Charleston right now at school, but your family's still there. Not only is the cold air up there, but you guys also seen some snow this week.
Yes, so we've seen 2 snow events now. We had one a couple of days ago, and then a northwest flow that came through today. Very light stuff today, although some places did see a few inches on Wednesday. And now the main story is cold. It is bitterly cold up on top of the mountains. Indeed, Mount Mitchell, I seem to have a fascination with Mount Mitchell, has been hovering in the wind chills in the -20s all day long, which is just more Arctic than North Carolina. I think I said that last show as well, but it's really true. Where it's just brutal cold, the kind of cold that you can't survive for long without proper garments. Looking into later tonight, we'll see wind chills dropping down once again to the minus teens above 3,500 feet. There is a wind chill advisory in effect for those areas, so we'll have to be careful with that. Even below 3,500 feet, it'll still be very painful wind chills, so people will have to watch out for that. My guess is that the higher peaks will probably see wind chills in the neighborhood of close to -20 to -30. Ricky was talking about that. That's pretty much the story that's going on for Western North Carolina right now. But I did want to talk about one of the airplanes that you were mentioning, Ricky, and how the tropopause is so low right now, meaning that the temperatures are pretty much at their coldest at the ground level. And once you start going up, the temperature starts rising. So it'll almost be warmer for them to get up in the air, which is one of those few times it's actually like that, which is pretty neat.
It is, and like we said, it's been cold here in the Carolinas. Obviously, the mountains seeing the brunt of it. But our buddy Chris Jackson, I don't know what spurred him to go up there. I think he wanted to check lake effect snow off his bucket list or something. But here's some footage that he just sent us. And guys, I think he's in Indiana or Michigan right now.
I thought he was on the Starship Enterprise getting ready to launch into space there.
Yeah, and he continues to send us pictures of his car thermometer. Last I seen it was like -15. He also shared a cool video of where they had a napkin that was wet, and he stuck it out the window, and it froze in less than a minute. So some crazy cold temperatures up there, but thankfully we do have a warm up, and I see that Shay's leaving. So Jared, I'll toss this to you because I know in coastal South Carolina you guys are cold, but we're starting to see some signs of a pretty big warm up where you guys may be in the 70s as early next week.
Yeah, with great 70s though comes great responsibility, and by responsibility I mean rain shower chances. So I mean it's it's one of those things where it's kind of like, okay, great, it's going to be in the 70s, but we might not get to really enjoy it. But yeah, the ridge is going to build back up. We're going to get a little more zonal after this polar vortex of death runs out of here, and so that'll be good. But yeah, we've been dealing with some of the coldest air of the season down here. Actually, 27 degrees is as cold as it's been all winter, and probably for quite a while, probably since last winter. So it's been it's been a little chilly, but nothing we can't handle. It's you know, no rolling blackouts or anything like that. We still have a plus sign in front of our temperatures, so pretty thankful for that part. And then we're going to start getting a warming trend starting Friday. It's going to be mid 60s over the weekend, getting into the possibly into the 70s next week, as you mentioned. But again, those rain chances, got to watch out for that.
Definitely. So the Climate Prediction Center put out their new graphic today, and it was showing, I think, through the 8th of February, Southeast was well above average probabilities of seeing some high, warmer temperatures. So I guess that's something we can look forward to, but it does look like as we get into there's the graphic. It does look like as we get into mid and late February, we could see another cold snap here for the East Coast. So that's something we'll have to watch as we go through the first part of February. So with that, anybody else have anything to discuss before we kind of jump off tonight?
It's not in the Carolinas, but there is a major fair happening right now in New Jersey, Elmwood Park, New Jersey. It's a paper mill or something like some sort of is that what it is? A paper mill of some type?
I think from looking at Twitter, I think that's what it is.
Yeah. It's a manufacturing facility of some sort, and I know they also either in their facility or neighbor facilities have gas canisters of some sort that were causing problems as well.
Yeah. So this thing is producing. Keep in mind that the weather there, we're below zero. We get wind chills below zero in New Jersey. But this thing is putting out a thermal signature on the GOES East satellite like you wouldn't believe. And then take that, overlay it with the radar. I'm gonna get. We're gonna kind of kick it old school here. I'm gonna grab a tweet real quick and show you this is really just an impressive signature. Big smoke plume showing up on radar, big thermal signature on the satellite, and using the infrared, you can see the shortwave infrared. I was sampling like 58 degrees Celsius, something like that from there. I mean, it's just absolutely bonkers. Let me see if I can't get a bigger version of this. I'm going to share my screen somehow. Sorry for the delay here, folks. This is just all kind of happening. Breaking news. And but yeah, so there's your there's your smoke plume on the radar. I've got the radar over top of GOES 16, and you can see the yellows and occasional reds. That's that really intense thermal signature coming from that fire. So we're seeing it from space. We're seeing it on the satellite. And again, it's probably pretty easy for that stuff to stand out next to such frigid air, but certainly a challenging situation for firefighters in that neck of the woods, considering just how cold it is. Probably rather difficult to get anything extinguished using ice. So I'm sure they're going to have other forms of flame retardant to do that. Or maybe they're just going to let it go out. This would be a good time to have Chris on to talk about how they might approach such a thing in such harsh conditions.
And Jared, I think it's worth noting, looking at that satellite and that radar, that smoke plume is then going over Manhattan, Queens, and into Nassau County. So those are pretty populated areas where folks are probably noticing this.
Saw Brad Panovich tweet that Teterboro was reporting smoke in their observations. So there you go.
Yeah, and that area also experienced the snow squall warning that kind of moved across from, I don't know, did it start in Ohio, Pennsylvania? Moved through, I know the major cities, Philly, New York City, Boston, all of them, Hartford, Connecticut, all experienced the snow squall warning. And that's, I guess, we just started this last year. So that's probably one of the more prominent snow squall warnings that we've seen so far since that new product has been released. So go ahead.
You look at the name 3, Scotty. It looked like a snow derecho. I'm just throwing it out there. Getting a new term tonight.
New term. There you go. There's your Weather Word Wednesday for next week, Melissa. Snow derecho. All right, guys. Well, we appreciate you joining us. Next week, we have on Mr. Sidney Sperry. He, along with Steve Piltz out at the National Weather Service in Tulsa, Oklahoma, came up with this Sperry Piltz ice accumulation index, or ice accretion index. I'll get it right here in just a little bit. But anyway, Sydney will be our guest next week. He's going to be talking to us about freeze and rain. He's provided a lot of graphics to kind of help explain this index that that is really not too old. I think it was back in the early 2010 area, 2010, 2011, I think is when this index was thought up of. So we're going to have Sydney on with us next week to talk about that. We all know here in the Carolinas, North, South Carolina, East Tennessee are prone to having our ice storms. So hopefully as Sydney comes on next week, he'll help us figure out the severity of these ice storms and just how much ice causes these issues or different issues. So that'll be with Sydney will be with us next week to talk about that. So we hope you have a great weekend. Enjoy the warm up. I think we all deserve it after this cold weather. Our thoughts are with those folks in the Midwest and Northeast who are experiencing this record-breaking cold. We hope that you guys get warm up there too. And we will see you back here next week for another episode of the Carolina Weather Group.
Stand by as the credits roll.